It's always fascinating to see what flavor of FUD gets doled out over time, and it seems that recently we've been seeing a few notable examples of folks saying something to the effect of, well, if you have an absolutely fixed money, then that inevitably leads to economic catastrophe. It doesn't support economic growth. It stifles growth and spending and all of this other stuff. Does that sound familiar? Well, today we are going to pick this apart and examine whether that claim actually has any merit. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist, and I'm excited to do today's video. I have left the Austrian economics playlist on this channel a little bit unloved for some time now. If you are not familiar, I have put a couple videos together on some of the basics behind Austrian economics because that really does underpin the monetary policy of Bitcoin and the concept of sound money more broadly. And so it's been a little while, and I may or may not have been provoked by the recent appearance of one Peter Zeihan on the Joe Rogan podcast. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But suffice it to say, there is an abundance of questionable claims about the notion of sound money. We've really been taught in society to fear it, to think that it's all this sort of old thing that didn't work, not only didn't work, but led to absolute catastrophe. And so today we are going to pick apart whether that is actually true. So you're not going to want to miss a thing. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends. As always, it is a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. If you like this type of content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our growing merry gang in cyberspace. I cover all manner of Bitcoin related content, including a whole slew of tutorials on how to acquire it, secure it, privacy best practices, running your own node, the Lightning Network, and more. You want it, I cover it. That is how this works. But with all that out of the way, let's jump into the meat for today and first examine the claim and assumptions underpinning it. So I'm not going to play this live, but those of you who spend too much time on Bitcoin Twitter have probably seen the Peter Zeihan interview on Joe Rogan, where a small portion of it, he goes into Bitcoin. And Peter, to his credit, is this incredibly competent sort of geopolitical analyst. I actually do think he has a lot of really, really interesting insights into how demographics, geography, and these other sort of really big macro pieces play into the macro economy. And so I think for all of that, it's very interesting. But he takes that competence and rolls it into other areas where he clearly knows nothing. And let's just say that the guy is not particularly humble. And so I'll link that in the description down below if you want to take a look. But I've seen this echoed not just from Peter recently. This was sort of the trigger that made me think to do a video this week on it. But it's interesting to see how some of these pieces of FUD get recycled over time. People realize that, oh, this piece of FUD has maybe fallen out of style or been so thoroughly debunked that let's move on to another thing, and maybe it's a new piece of FUD or an old piece of FUD that people forgot was debunked. So we're going to do some re-debunking today, but I think it's important for us to pick this apart and really understand the arguments as to why, because if you think about it, there are a lot of folks out there, in fact the vast majority, who have been taught their entire lives that no, sound money, that was this old thing that was very dangerous. It worked for a little while, but that's archaic. It's in the past. It led to all these booms and busts, right? The panic of, blah, blah. And so we've been taught to fear it. And those of us very deep down the Bitcoin rabbit hole sometimes forget that this is just a very foundational piece. Like if you're new to Bitcoin and you know nothing more than its 21 million supply cap, and you have this sort of existing existential fear of sound money, you're not going to get past that first hurdle and explore all the other facets and dimensions, such as its censorship resistance properties and what have you. And so for inspiration in this video, I'm going to be referencing a terrific article by John Haar, who works over at Swan Bitcoin, and it is entitled, very appropriately, Why a Fixed Supply Money Does Not Lead to Economic Catastrophe. I will, of course, link this in the description down below. It's an excellent article, very well worth the read. But I will be hitting on some of the key themes and also pulling in some of the work from Saifedean and others. And so to properly assess this claim, let's look at some of the underpinning either assumptions or different flavors that this claim can take on. And so as you can see, John lays out 5 main ones. Number 1, we must have expansionary money and circulation credit to achieve more economic growth. By circulation credit, he means the ability for banks to create money out of thin air by extending loans, right? These are just ledger entries as opposed to me literally loaning out the savings that I have accumulated, right? So we must have it. We must have it in order to achieve economic growth. And that's why the 2% inflation target is such an important thing, right? Just a little bit of growth, right? We'll examine whether that's actually true. Number 2, fixed supply money leads to prices declining over time, which leads to the hoarding of money, which means a lack of spending and investment, which means high unemployment and economic recessions. And if we apply very surface level thinking, that doesn't sound all that unreasonable. We'll look at that as well. Number 3, it is actually unjust. So there's a moral argument here that someone could see their purchasing power maintained or even increase over time for, quote, doing nothing other than holding money. Number 4, we actually need an expansion of money and circulation credit to redistribute resources from the haves to the have-nots. And number 5, we need an expansion of money and credit to, quote, stimulate our economy, particularly during times of recession. All right, so now that we've laid that out, let's go ahead and analyze each of these components. Okay, so the first one, expansionary money supply is necessary for economic growth. This is one you hear time and time again, and it's just incredible that this is just a foundational assumption and belief held by the vast majority of the population, right? So critically, we first have to distinguish that money is not wealth. Money is not goods and services, i.e. the things that you want and desire to satisfy your different needs and wants. Money is really a measuring stick in order to trade amongst each other. Goes back to the coincidence of wants, right? If I raise cows and you fix shoes, I can basically only do one thing. I can get my shoes fixed in exchange for, one of my cows or what have you. But now all of a sudden, if we can both trade into a single common good, a monetary good, that opens up vast new possibilities of trade and exchange. And so this would be akin to thinking that just by changing our unit of measurement or changing the measuring stick just to make it a little bit bigger, that magically makes whatever thing that we're measuring bigger as well. And of course, we know that logically that's simply not true. So money maps onto goods and services, and if all we've done is increase the supply of money, then we've simply increased the price of those same amount of goods and services. Now you may say, well, wait a second. No, this encourages entrepreneurs to take on projects and create economic growth for society, right? If you can't loan money, then you don't have projects, you don't have economic growth and all this and that. And indeed, lending has been around for thousands of years of human history. And so on a sound money standard, banks still exist. Like the core functions of banks will still exist. And we'll talk about this later in the video. But there's a big, big difference between voluntary lending, i.e. me as a saver, I've sort of put forth some of my savings to be lent out to support some project, and in return, I expect to get some sort of return, versus a situation where maybe I'm an entrepreneur, I walk into a bank, I present a proposal for a business, the bank says, hey, that sounds great, here's some money added to your account. It's not literally the case that the bank has taken someone else's savings and added it to my account suddenly. It is simply that they have generated that new amount out of thin air with a simple keystroke. And so I'm getting to increase my purchasing power immediately on the spot in order to fund some project. And the question is like, well, where did that purchasing power come from? It was extracted from the existing savers who have now been diluted. And so when you think about it that way, you already sort of have this notion of like, well, is that right? Is that moral? Is that just? How did I get all the savers to agree that they were okay with being diluted for the sake of me conducting a project which may or may not pay off? So even if my project generates an economic return in real terms, there's still the fact that I gained that purchasing power initially by extracting that value from all of society, who certainly did not say that I could do so. And even worse, if my idea is bad and I destroy value, then this strictly causes harm to others. So there's a logical element to this in terms of money not equaling goods and services, but then there's also this moral component that I think is really interesting to think about. All right, number 2, this is a big one. The idea that people will hoard when prices are falling, right? If I have a perfectly fixed supply of money, then the value of that money over the long run would go up by about the growth in productivity in the economy. And so if there's a totally fixed supply of money, productivity goes up by 3%, I would expect that the value on average prices to fall. That is to say, my money is now 3% more valuable versus the goods and services that the money is chasing. And so people say, well, what would stop people from just sitting on their cash and never spending and just hoarding it all? But this critique misses two huge examples. One, if we start with just first principles, we know that people prefer things now versus in the future. So this claim completely and utterly ignores something that we know to be true from our own experience. Furthermore, amidst this aggregate inflation that we experience in society, there are certain products and services that experience deflation, where their prices come down over time. Typically, these are technological goods. Think of things like computers or TVs, and ask the very simple question as to, are people not buying any TVs or computers because they expect that the prices will continue to go down, down, down every single year? Simply not true. And so the hoarding piece really falls on its face, again, both from a logical sense, and we just do not see that behavior when looking at very deflationary pockets of the broader economy. Number 3, this one gets interesting. This moral argument that, hey, if you're just holding money, it's morally wrong for your purchasing power to go up over time. And you may say, what a ludicrous claim, but you have folks deeply in the mainstream who are making these claims. You see this view from Joe Weisenthal. This is a Bloomberg anchor. It would be immoral, in my opinion, to have a monetary system that allowed a time traveler from 100 years ago to maintain their purchasing power all that time without having done anything in that time other than store money under a mattress. So I get that there are questions around distribution when it comes to money. That is certainly an important point. But if we're assuming that we're in a reasonably fair society and people actually earn the money that they get, certainly this would be the case in a sound money paradigm. The only way that you can earn money in a sound money paradigm is by creating something of value for your fellow humans. There are no political connections that you could form in order to gain yourself a seat at the trough that is the money printer. And so therefore, this comment from Joe and others completely ignores the fact that people worked, right? They spent some of their time that they will never get back in order to acquire those units of money. Furthermore, we know that deferred consumption is the basis and bedrock of capital accumulation, which has ushered in untold prosperity for the human race. The more capital we accumulate, the more leverage we can give to each hour of our time, and therefore the higher productivity and higher standard of living that we get. And if we poke at this a little bit more, you might also say, well, if we're making a moral argument, isn't it morally unjust to force people to become speculative investors simply to preserve the purchasing power of the money that they've already earned? Right? You didn't think about that, Joe. So because we have inflation, because we have this elastic monetary supply, you now all of a sudden have this competition among participants in the economy to get that seat as close as they can to the money printer. So big corporations get lower lending rates. Big banks, of course, get to drink from the trough. Political insiders, etc., etc. And so that leaves the average Joe with increasing costs, and his or her income is not increasing by the same amount. So now they have to go and buy, all this crazy stuff just to stay in the same place, just to tread water. So if we're talking about morality, wouldn't you agree that it is more moral to allow people to benefit from what they've already worked hard to earn rather than force them to learn a totally unique skill just to preserve that value of what they've earned? So number 3 also, I think, falls on its face. Number 4 is about the need to redistribute resources, right? We need some way to get resources from the haves to the have-nots. Now, even if we believed that this was morally just, we need to merely look no further than the last couple decades to understand that this is not an outcome that a expansionary money supply produces. If anything, it is the complete opposite. The haves continue to get richer at the direct expense of the have-nots, who see their costs rise because they get access to the newly created money later than those who are well connected to the central control apparatus that is the money printer. This is known as the Cantillon effect. So this one falls on its face. And then finally, even if you're following along and saying, look, okay, I get what you're saying, you may say, well, look, sometimes you have downturns and you just need to create some money elasticity in order to pull the economy back out of that rut. Surely we can agree on that. And history just doesn't seem to support this claim either. Saifuddin and others often cite the forgotten depression in the US of 1921. We always hear about the one in 1929, the Great Depression. But curiously enough, you had an extremely sharp, deep downturn and recession that resolved itself relatively quickly. And what was even more interesting is that not only was the government not printing money in order to try and pull the economy out of that situation, they were actually curtailing spending during that time. So you have the direct opposite direction as that we've been told to believe, right? And then you compare that to what happened with the Great Depression, where it's pretty clearly the case that all this expansionary interventionism, whether it's increasing money supply, price controls, all these sorts of actions, only led to prolong the Great Depression longer than it had to be. And even in more modern times, we go back to the Great Financial Crisis, 08-09, all the sort of bailouts and all the can kicking that has happened since then is yet another good example. So sure, you may stabilize the system a bit, but you're surely not cleansing and healing the underlying rot that is causing the issue in the first place. Many often point to the golden era in the late 1800s, which was largely characterized by most nations on earth being on a gold standard. That was probably the closest that human society has been to a universal sound money standard, and it was a period of time of relative peacefulness and amazing innovation and economic transformation. And so it begs the question, well, what would a world look like on a fixed monetary standard, right? This is different than gold. Gold was certainly sound money, but even gold supply has some non-zero amount of elasticity in response to the demand for it. So what would that look like on a true Bitcoin standard? Well, first of all, there probably and unfortunately would be a fairly brutal adjustment period akin to getting a drug addict off drugs. They've been using that for decades. Jeff Booth talks a lot about this and talks about thinking through this transition and really helping people visualize what that transition looks like. And I frankly don't think we have all the answers just yet, but it would certainly be some short-term pain. And we should not throw that out as a non-consideration. That's really, really important of how we get to the other side. We would ideally hope to see some of these huge debt bubbles, sovereign debt in particular, unwound significantly before making such a transition, but it certainly remains to be seen. But let's say that we do somehow make it to that other side. As I mentioned earlier, you would still have banks. You would still have banking functions. This includes the custodying of assets. I know, even as much as we encourage self-custody, it is simply not practical to expect all 8 billion people to self-custody their money. They're going to want even what is perceived as additional safety by storing it with banks or other institutions, entities. That is simply going to happen. And you will also have lending. And you may even have fractional lending. There's nothing about a pure Bitcoin standard that stops fractional lending. It is simply the case that banks are going to be much more readily called on their BS if they are employing risky practices. And there's going to be just a lot of competition to keep banks honest. So while the market probably will still demand and accept the risk of fractional lending, I think you would have much, much, much less of it. And then ideally, you would have the majority of lending be honest in what John calls commodity credit. That is to say, I deposit some of my savings with some institution who turns around and literally lends that out to someone else. And I earn, hopefully, the principal back as well as some return. You'd likely see other assets such as real estate maybe become slightly less monetized, although I'm not totally convinced yet on which assets will or will not. I think it's certainly safe to say things like bonds will cease to be the sort of dominant store of value, right? That will be long gone by the time we get to a full sound money standard on Bitcoin. And if we were to now suddenly not be monetizing debt, which is what happens today, claim to money is the same as money itself. That is the paradigm we currently live in. That would likely be severed, and this would have enormous implications for nation states. They would not be able to spend like absolutely drunken sailors, and this would have huge implications on capital markets as well. At the company or business level, you would also probably have much less credit financing and more equity financing. And we haven't even started to discuss the more accurate price signals that would allow better economic calculation and more intelligent allocation of resources, whose benefits could be truly, truly immense for the human race. Now, we should also try and be objective and anticipate potential issues or concerns with this, of which there are certainly some. One of these ideas is the idea of divisibility. Yes, a fixed money supply is okay, but only if it is sufficiently divisible to support economic transactions of a vast array of sizes. And so there's 8 decimal points today in the Bitcoin system. And who knows, we may find ourselves in a world where we need even more divisibility than that, where one Satoshi needs to be further divided, which would require a hard fork of Bitcoin. That is not trivial at all. So we should at least acknowledge that. And in these types of discussions, I always think it's important to continually be sharpening our swords. So it is important to sort of try and hear the other side. What we've gone through today, I think, are some of the most common objections. If you want to go deeper, I would encourage you to seek out some of the work of Jeff Snyder, who's well known for his Eurodollar University. And I must say, the dude's command of monetary history is pretty much unparalleled. And the mere existence of the Eurodollar market and how it works is an interesting example that perhaps points to this idea of like, well, the Eurodollar market wouldn't exist if the market didn't demand elasticity of money. So again, I'm not going to dig into that today. Perhaps we'll reserve that for a future video. But if you want to go deeper into the other side of the argument, I would encourage you to check out some of Jeff's work. With all of that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. All right, so we took a look at this claim that a fixed supply money can't possibly be compatible with economic growth and human prosperity. A big shout out once again to John Haar, whose excellent article I used as inspiration for this video. I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? What are some ideas either in favor or against a sound money paradigm? Let me know in the comments down below, but I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video to get this to more folks. I really think this is an important pillar of Bitcoin that I think those of us who have already gone down the rabbit hole very much take for granted, when it's the case that the vast majority of folks out there believe that sound money is this sort of thing to be feared. So I think it's something that we should take head on. And if you were so enamored by this content and you want to donate to a pleb, which really does help me continue to make these videos, I will leave my Lightning address and Strike account on the screen that you will see momentarily. Never expected, always very much appreciated. But for now, my friends, we'll go ahead and leave this here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.